welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host Kushalmehra. My guest today is Dr. Nalin Mehta. Dr. Nalin Mehta is the Dean for the School of Modern Media, UPES. He's the advisor of Global University Systems and non-resident senior fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University, Singapore. But today we're going to be talking about his latest book called The New BJP, Modi and the Making of the World's Largest Political Party. Nalin, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Kushal. I follow the Cārvāka podcast quite a lot. So delighted to be here and looking forward to a crackling discussion.
Thank you very much. Nalin, before I started today's discussion, I have to say, and I say this and I mean this, and I wanted to say this when we were live, obviously when offline, this is one of the best books I have read after a long time. So to begin with, I genuinely want to congratulate you on an excellent book. So I usually start like this, Nalin. Every time I have a discussion with an author is that I have to ask them, like, this book is very data driven. It's obviously a 600 plus page book with a lot of citations, notes, appendices too. So why this book? Why did you choose to pick up a topic like this?
Thanks very much, Kushal, for your comments. Why this book? See, look, I'm a political junkie. I've tracked the BJP for over 20 years. As a journalist, wearing different hats, as a journalist, as a political scientist, as somebody who engages in public debate. What happened was that sometime around 2017, we started, the fact of the matter is that between 2014 to 2019, the BJP has won, whether you support the BJP, whether you're against the BJP, whether you are neutral on it, keep that aside. The fact of the matter is, the BJP has won more elections than it has lost between 2014 to 19, or done better in those elections as compared to what it was doing in those elections, both at the central and at the state government levels. So the question this book tries to answer, and why I wrote this book, fundamentally, intellectually, was I wanted to understand why this is happening, because the BJP, the ideology of the BJP, the ideology of Hindu nationalism as a broader category, has been around since the 50s, right? Since the time of the Jansangh. So, and the core constituency of Hindutva, many liberals make the mistake of thinking that it's only because of Hindutva and so on that the BJP has been doing this or has made these electoral advances. That remains constant. That's 17-18%, depending on who you talk to. The fact of the matter is the BJP has advanced electorally in the last 5 years significantly and become the largest party in the world and the primary pole of India's politics because it has managed to get across to its fold a newer class of voters cutting across lines of gender, class, caste, to some extent religion. Now, whether these are floating voters or whether they stay with it for the long term is another thing. But these voters voted for it in ways they never voted before. So the question I wanted to ask was, why? And what is happening in this country? Because this challenges every paradigm of political science research and the paradigms of that define our traditional understanding of politics that I was familiar with, one. Secondly, you mentioned data. Sometime around 2017, December, around the time of the last Gujarat election, my colleague, the data scientist Rishabh Srivastav, who works out of Singapore, who I think is one of the most kick-ass data coders anywhere in the world on data, he and I were working out the election coverage for Gujarat, and he showed me some new data dashboards where he had interconnected a whole bunch of political economic data and connected it to electoral constituency levels at the assembly level. When I saw that data set, it completely blew my mind, because what it was showing me was different from what the pollsters was telling us. It was different from what our understanding as journalists was. So we said, okay, now there's something here. See, the thing with data is that data can often give you a partial picture. It can also give you a misleading picture if you get your questions wrong. But even if you get everything right, it can tell you what happened. In an ideal world, it can't tell you why it happened. It can't tell you whether this was just a correlation of things or whether something was done specifically to trigger those events, those patterns that you see in the data. So what we then did was, and this was at a very experimental stage then, we then traveled across Gujarat after seeing those data sets and after improving those data sets and seeing those dashboards. And we traveled constituency by constituency in that election to see what's happening on the ground, to whether कि सिर्फ कागज पे हो रहा है, data set में हो रहा है, कि जमीन पे भी हो रहा है कि नहीं हो रहा है. And then that validated some of those assumptions. Then we tested this model further in the Karnataka elections of 2018. And again, we found a similar result. And then in the 5 state elections of 2018 December in Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, and a couple of other states. And that firstly reassured us about our modeling and what was happening. And what we did was, then the idea of the book was born, that we said, okay, fine. Now there is something deep happening in this country that we are not catching, but the data tells us one part of the story. Now we need to supplement it to first validate it, cross-triangulate it, do a whole bunch of things. So for example, we used a lot of satellite imagery. And we triangulated it to the constituency level, and we matched it with many other data sets. And then we did more than 200 interviews with different political leaders across different parties, across different states. We then went to the archives. We looked at the BJP archives, the RSS archives, the archive in Rambau Malgi Pramodini, which is a training center near Thane, where there's a phenomenal BJP and RSS archive. So that really improved my understanding of the backstory of this, if you like. And then we put it all together. And also the archive at the Murthy Memorial Library, the Nehru Memorial Library at the Murthy in Delhi. And that, that was that was all the raw material that went into the making of this book. And after the 2019 election, after the BJP won its second triumph at the national level under Narendra Modi, that's when I started writing the book. And I will say, I'll just conclude by saying one thing. Look, I'm a political junkie. I've said that before. I read 5-6 papers a day across at least 2 languages. I've run large news organizations where my full-time job was to track politics. But 80 to 90% of what was in the book, what is in the book now, I did not know before we started digging below the surface. It surprised me. And that's why it took us so long to validate it, to cross-validate, to make sure that this is correct. Because some of the data I couldn't believe myself when I first saw it. So it took us a lot of time to validate it, to cross, and it completely changed my understanding of what's happening in this country.
What blew me away was just like, for example, when you begin it, you talk about a database that you guys were looking at. So I'm reading from your book, you say this newly created database on BJP literature includes 8,579 BJP speeches, press releases, and party articles published over 13 years between 2005 and 2019, 4.98 million words to be precise. 162 issues of the BJP fortnightly magazine Kamal Sandesh, which is 2009 to 19, 230 issues of the RSS weekly organizer, May 2015 to December 2019. And you go ahead and you state a lot of things. But now I want to talk about something before we get into it in the beginning itself. So there are 2 specific tools that you have used in this book. One obviously being the Narad Index, right? And the other is, if I remember the name correctly, was the Mehta Singh Index, right?
Yes.
So now, for the benefit of my listeners and viewers, I will request you, because now somebody might say, "Bhaiya, podcast hai, itna technical kyun ja rahe ho? Jana hai, or jana padega." Because this book, until and unless, because at the end of the day, you have created a model, and until and unless we don't understand what your modeling is based on, and how, so like, for example, I did state what were the data sets you were giving a look at in, but what are these 2 indices and what do you do through that? If you could explain that to begin with.
So actually, Kushal, we created 3 new properties around data. The first is the Narad Index. The second is the Mehta Singh Social Index, as you pointed out. And the third is Poll Niti. So I'll take each of these one by one. The Narad Index is 11,500 BJP linked documents running over a 15-year period. The point of that was that we see what happens is that when we analyze, the idea of that was to basically to analyze what is the party communicating, how are those patterns of communication changing to different audiences, and how do they vary across the different levels of the party and the wider Sangh Parivar. Is there a difference? If there is a difference, what is that difference? And what does that tell us? That was the idea. So what we did was we looked at both its offline communications and it's online communications. In the offline communication, we took about 8,500 BJP documents, which is every speech by BJP leaders, which is published on their website. All speeches by the party presidents, all articles, all press releases by the party. So that told us offline, this is what is disseminated in their offline literature. Then we took all the speeches of Prime Minister Narendra Modi as Prime Minister, some more than 1,300 speeches. Then we looked at the organizer, some 230 issues to tell us what the RSS is thinking. We also looked at all the Vijayadashmi speeches by the RSS Sarsad Chalak, which is the equivalent of their State of the Union kind of address, which is an annual event. Then we also looked at the Sangh affiliated body. To give an example of what the Sangh bodies talk about, we picked up the Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram, which is also a case study in the book, which works in tribal areas. And we took their mouthpiece and we took all of their issues, over 200 issues, and we digitized them. Over and above that, we also took all issues of the Kamal Sandesh, which is the BJP's mouthpiece, but we compared it also with the Congress equivalent of that to see what is the distinction. And this was the offline part. The online part, we tracked the social media accounts of some 75 political leaders from different parties over a 3-year period on Twitter and Facebook. And that included the accounts of Amit Shah, Narendra Modi, key party leaders on the BJP, but also the opposition, Rahul Gandhi, and so on and so forth. And we looked at it both at the national level and at the state level, because very often the communication at the national level is different, and by the same party at the state level, they privilege different issues. What we were looking to see was to understand what are the issues in their communication the party, through its various arms and branches, privileges. When does it privilege them? When do they change? And how does that link to what is happening in the wider sphere of politics? And is there a pattern we can see? Right? So that was fun. That is what the Narad Index is. The second, the Mehta Singh Social Index, is essentially an index which is focused on Uttar Pradesh for the purpose of this book, where we tracked 4,500 politicians in UP over in the period between 1990 to 2019, and we looked at politicians from BJP, Samajwadi Party, BSP, and the Congress, and we did it at 5 or 6 different levels. The idea was to see the BJP has always been called an upper caste dominated party, an urban-based party, a party of a Brahmin and Baniyas. That's the older characterization of the BJP, and that was true for a very long time. Now, I wanted to see, does that still hold, or has it changed? What does the data tell us? So what we did was we tracked and we focused on Uttar Pradesh, because Uttar Pradesh has been at the vanguard of the BJP's electoral advances since 2014. Hindi heartland overall, the 10 states, the 10 Hindi-speaking states of the Hindi heartland overall, Uttar Pradesh centrally, as part of that. So what did we do? We looked at all Lok Sabha candidates in the 80 Lok Sabha seats of UP. We looked at every Lok Sabha candidate fielded by these 4 parties over a long period of time. We looked at the 2017 election, in particular, the assembly election. So below the Lok Sabha level, at the state assembly level, we looked at their 403 Vidhan Sabha seats in UP. So we looked at every single candidate fielded by these 4 parties in the last 2017 election. The third level we looked at is that after election, what happens? What is the share of power you give to people? So we tracked the Council of Ministers of Yogi Adityanath. What is the caste profiles of that? Vis-a-vis, see, that doesn't tell you much. What the comparison is, if you see, the point of this was that we did that, and then we looked at the office bearers in BJP in UP, what was their castes, and finally we looked at the district level. So below the state office bearer level, at the micro level, there are 98 district presidents of the BJP in UP. UP doesn't have 98 districts, but several districts, it has more than one president. There's 98 presidents. So we tracked them. The idea of this was that when you track it across so many different registers, it will give you a social snapshot of the kinds of people the party is putting in positions of influence and who they are bringing in. And the point of it was to see, is this constant over the years, or has it changed post 2014? If it has changed, what is the nature of that change? And equally importantly, how does this compare with its competition? So, and that's why we tracked SP, BSP, and Congress, because when you look at social profiles, there is an ideal world that, okay, so many castes, this is the caste profile of India. So the political representation should match that equally. That is the ideal world. When people vote, they are voting for what is the best possible alternative in that compared to other parties. So then it's important to compare in a comparative nature that between the 4 or 5 parties on offer, whose social profile is more representative. And when did it change, and did it have an impact on the final outcome or not? Obviously, caste is an important factor. It's not the only factor on which people vote, no question about that, but it's a very important factor in the growth of the new BJP. That's why we tracked this. And the third one was Poll Niti. Poll Niti is essentially a collection of 218 interactive data dashboards. 8 of them are focused on the economy. About 100 of them are focused on elections between 1980 to 2019, all kinds of state elections down to the constituency level. And then there are a whole bunch of dashboards on social media. So we put them together, interlinked them to understand that there is a political story, there's a caste story happening, there's a social welfare story happening, there are other things happening. How does that intersect with the wider political economy? And is there a connection in that? So we also brought that together. For example, I'll give you one example. For example, in Poll Niti, we tracked satellite data, which became available from a French satellite at very low cost, which showed us data from 2005 to 2019, which allowed us to track night lights. Now, night lights can be a proxy for economic activity. And there's a whole economic literature around that. So we tracked it, we used it specifically to see what's happened in the northeastern states. In the 7 northeastern states, to see, because one of the claims the BJP makes is that with the double engine sarkar, there was much greater progress. Now, there are many indicators you can see to verify whether that claim is right or wrong, or what are the issues in those claims. But night lights gives you another additional parameter outside of government data to cross-check that. So that's what we used.
On the night lights, I remember even Vivek Dahija, they also had written a paper talking about it, if I remember it correctly. But now I want to focus on a particular quote in your book. So you state here, despite being political junkies and having reported on the state for years, our findings on caste representation in the Mehta Singh index stunned us. Now, why did you get stunned, Nalin?
So, okay. Let me explain that. First, the dominant paradigm in political science scholarship on the BJP has been that it's been an upper caste dominated party, urban based, and Brahmin Baniya party. In fact, if you look at the most recent, some of the greatest scholars in the world who study the BJP, one of the most prominent among them is Christophe Jaffrelot, based out of Sciences Po in Paris. Also teaches at King's College in London, also affiliated with Carnegie Endowment, also on the board of Ashoka University's Center for the Trivedi Center for Political Science and Data. And they had set up this database which tracked the social profiles of members of parliament in particular across India. And in their most recent work, they published, Christophe, for example, published Modi's India just recently, initially with Princeton University Press, and then published in India by Context. In India, it was published in sometime around November in 2021, and also in a number of academic articles globally. Christophe individually and Christophe and Gilles Berniers, who heads the center at Ashoka, together, where they argued, and this is and they are quoted in the book, where they argued that the advances of the BJP, and I'm paraphrasing here, in 2019 were characterized by what they called, and I quote here, the revenge of the upper caste elite, right? And they say that 2019 even more so than 2014. And along with that, they published a social profile of members of parliament in the Lok Sabha, in the current Lok Sabha, where they showed that the BJP is the most upper caste dominated party when you look at the social profiles of members of parliament, and that this is what has primarily driven the advance of the BJP. They also talked about other intermediary castes coming to the party and so on, but fundamentally the thesis was this, right? Now, this is important because it's not just one scholar saying it. This is a center which puts out this data. Some of the most prominent scholars quote that data. Their entire reams of academic articles around the world quote that data, right? Because that is because I'll tell you why they quote that. Because the there are the people who track caste as a social category in India. There are only 2 people. There is CSDS fundamentally on an absolute level, which tracks the caste of voters, but it does it in post-poll surveys or in pre-poll surveys. And then on the basis of that survey, it shows you that so many percent of Dalits voted here, so many percent of OBCs voted here, so many percent of upper caste, right? There are other election agencies that also do that, but those are all election surveys which necessarily are based on a sampling. You can get that sampling right or wrong, and some are better than the others. But the only center that tracks the the caste of politicians on any significant scale is this center, and that's why it is quoted by everybody, right? And it's a major bulwark of political science scholarship on Indian politics generally, and on BJP in particular. Now, when my first issue with this was that when we were reporting in various elections in the Hindi heartland in particular and UP specifically, this didn't seem to me to be the case. Upper caste remained with the BJP, no question about it. But the shift was not in the upper caste. The shift was with the OBCs and non-Yadav OBCs in particular, and to a lesser extent, non-Yadav Dalits. Now, the issue is when you've got a data set on one side and you've got anecdotal evidence on the other. And by the way, this is the view of many reporters, and none of these reporters, by the way, were, in these times of echo chambers, most reporters are characterized, ye pro BJP hai, ye anti BJP hai, right? I am not talking about pro BJP reporters. I'm talking about serious journalists who are not tarred by one side or the other, or even if they are, they have an understanding of the ground. Whatever they say in public is different, but on the ground, when they report, they have a sense of what's happening on the ground. So this is something that I was feeling in my reporting for a long while, but there was a data set which was very authoritative, which argued the revenge of the upper caste elite. So then what we did was, we said, okay, fine, let's test this out. The other thing I want to point out here is very important. Narendra Modi, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, about a year and a half back, and this is before we built our database, he gave a speech to the BJP's members of parliament, which was reported in public. And he said in his speech that 68% of the BJP's MPs in this Lok Sabha, the BJP had more than 300 MPs who were elected in 2019. He put out some figures. He said 68.9% of our MPs are either OBC or scheduled caste or scheduled tribe, right? So now, if you take out the seats which are reserved for scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, if you take those seats out of the 300 plus MPs that BJP got elected, even then the percentage of these categories among the BJP's MPs was almost 60%. Now, this is one side of the debate. On the other side, Christoph Jafferlaw and the Trivedi Center's data scientists and political scientists who work on it, Gilles Vernier and others, they argued that overall, it's the upper caste that dominated this current Lok Sabha among BJPs, and only 18% were OBCs. Now, see, you can have a different interpretation of facts. You can't have different facts. So one of the things I started from and is noted in the book is, on this side, on one side is Modi's data, where he's claiming a certain social profile for his members of parliament. On the other side is this academic data, which is by far that defines the dominant paradigm of scholarship so far. One of them has to be wrong. Both of them cannot be right. So to test who is right, we built the Mehta Singh index by focusing on UP. To see independently, let's verify कि यार ये actually क्या है. And that's how, the categories I told you. And then I told myself and my team, Sanjeev Singh, the very senior journalist who worked with me on this, and there was a whole bunch of people who worked on this, but we built that index as a way of objectively finding in UP what has happened over the last 40 years. And we said, okay, MPs is only one category. MPs can only give you a partial reality. Let's look at MLAs also. Let's look at ministers also. Let's look at office bearers also. Let's look at district level office bearers also. And what we found was that the reality is totally different from what the academic discourse is telling you. The academic discourse so far has been far behind the reality. And what did we find? We found in the Lok Sabha of 2019, among the BJP's candidates fielded from UP, 57.5% were OBC or SC, right? In the Vidhan Sabha of 2017 in UP, 52.8% candidates were OBC or SC. Office bearers in Uttar Pradesh of the BJP are 50% from these two categories. In the Ministerial Council of Yogi Adityanath, there are all these, there's a lot of talk of Thakurvad, of Thakur dominance, because of Yogi Adityanath is the Mathadhish of the Gorakhnath Peeth, the only Thakur Peeth in India in Gorakhpur. In his Council of Ministers, 48.1% of ministers are OBC or SC. And in the district level, 35.6% were OBC or SC. Now, this is a fact. Now, why is it a fact? It's not just me saying it or the other half of the Mehta Singh Index, Sanjeev Singh saying it. What we did was we tested it out multiple times. We worked with a whole bunch of resources in every district in UP. We got it blind peer reviewed. We also had it tested separately with the voting agency, Voters Mood Research, Jay Murg. He and his team independently did another survey, and we matched our findings. And only when we were absolutely sure, even after multiple levels of testing this, we then did random checks. We traveled around district after district and talked to politicians of all sides to say, okay, you're from this district. Here's my data for this district. Can you look at it and see what's wrong in this? Have you made a mistake on this person's caste? And only when we were absolutely sure that this is ironclad that we went ahead with publishing this.
One thing that I have found very interesting is, I don't know if this was your experience too. People tend to make basic elementary errors when they understand India. So I'll give you an example in Maharashtra. So I'll give you two surnames, for example. One is Mahajan, one is Rajurkar. Now, Mahajan and Rajurkar can be a Brahmin, can be SC/ST, both, and an OBC.
Yes.
OBC. So
Yes.
you can have the same. So what I notice is, and I'm trying to be as polite as I can when I say this, a lot of South Asian analyses of India, when it is analyzed from outside, यार उनको basics नहीं आते हमारे.
So
I don't know how to say
Kushal,
this.
let me add to what you're saying. You are absolutely right. The two examples you gave from Maharashtra. Let me give you 4-5 more examples. You see, the easiest mistake somebody makes on caste is you see a name on a sheet and you think it's a Singh, so a Thakur hoga. A Singh can be a OBC also, can be within OBC a Jat also, can be some other caste also, can be Dalit also, can be upper caste also. In UP, for example, there are 5 kind of Varmas. Varmas from Noida are Gujars, which is OBC. Varmas from Eastern UP are scheduled caste. Varmas from near Bulandshahr are Sunars, which is OBC. Varmas from the Awadh region are Kurmis, which is also an OBC subcaste. Those from Eastern UP are Kayast. Similarly, if you're a Rawat from Uttarakhand, you are a Thakur, but Rawats from other places are Dalits. So what happens is that typically and which is why when we were testing out our methodology, it wasn't about if 5 people tell us if this person is that caste, we won't agree with that. We had to make sure that people who know that family in that district and that party in that district are verifying it. Otherwise, very often, even people from the nearby district make a mistake about caste. I'll give you an example of which Sanjeev in fact pointed out to me, that in the case of former UP Chief Minister Jagdambika Pal, for example, is a Thakur. But even people from his own party, for many years, long after he stepped down as Chief Minister, he was invited to caste-based OBC sammelans because many people in his own party thought he OBC hai. But he isn't. So that is the kind of mistakes that happen, and you have to be very careful in making this data, in making claims like this, and you have to check each name, and you have to know who's the veracity of who's giving you that information. We kept records for each of that. See, the other point is that when academics, and I think it's a very important thing for academics when they make these claims, because academic credibility is based on the quality of your work. If you get the facts wrong, then I'm sorry. At worst, it is terrible scholarship. At best, it is terrible scholarship. At worst, it is academic fraud. And I do not say this lightly.
Do you know what bothers me, Nalin? Because you stated this. I call it the citation loop. You create, I don't know how to say this. You create a sense of authority and aura around something, whether it's an individual or an institution. They use bad methodology, bad data, and they don't replicate their data, right? The key thing when you do a scientific analysis is not only do you do a double blind placebo controlled study, or you do some sort of sampling, you replicate your data, right? You try to replicate it through other places. Now, when you don't even have basic understanding of a culture, and then you create that data and that sample, everybody goes around citing that, भैया मैंने तो इनको cite किया है, ये तो recognize that, and it creates that citation loop, and then there will be 500 articles that are written referencing that data set, and then that data set and those articles then go on Wikipedia pages as reference material. Now, aam aadmi, see, you can't expect an average human being, right, to be so nerdy that they're going to check every reference out and they're going to do. So my question to you in general is that how the hell do we solve this then?
So, okay, may I just make a small point on this before I respond to your question, with your permission?
Sure.
There is on this, you see, the new BJP and the findings in the new BJP in the book has sparked off a big public debate, right?
It has.
For example, and Christoph and Giles have written a rejoinder to my findings. I then, on Network 18, I then wrote I published an extract. They wrote a rejoinder to it where they questioned my findings. I wrote a rejoinder to that rejoinder. That is available in the public domain. Those who are watching or anybody who's interested can take a look at those articles and judge them on their own merit, for the facts or otherwise in those. But I'll say one thing, that one of the things that I pointed out was that, and this goes to your question, to the heart of your question about methodology. Methodology must be transparent. Methodology has to be very specific and based on ground understanding. For example, one of the points that Christoph and Giles raised in their rejoinder to me, and I would love to have this debate with them. They're not here, so I'll just argue. I'll just point out what they said in my response to it. On this one instance, they said actually difference is probably not, apart from many other things which they said which were factually wrong. They said the difference is maybe just because of academic classification. Actually, it's because Nalin probably counted these caste in a different manner than us by classification. Agar hum category same rakhte, if the categories had been the same, then the finding would have been similar, and they claimed that. Right? And they pointed out the example of Jats in particular, saying that we did not count Jats as OBCs in UP, and if we had counted them for the sake of argument, if we had indeed counted them, our result would have been similar. Yeah, my answer is very simple. How did you not count Jats as OBC? Jats, this is specific to this Mehta Singh index has been published everywhere. It's been said from the rooftop. It's specific to UP. In UP, under this, there's a constitution in this country, and there are laws in this country which list out castes. This is not a matter of a trifling matter of an academic debate about this is right or that is wrong. In UP, 21 years ago, Jats were classified on the OBC list, in the state list as an OBC, as OBCs. They are listed in the top 5 castes among OBCs out of 79 castes 21 years ago. If you did not count Jats as OBCs in your classification, and you deign to include them now, all I can say is you've been 21 years too late, dude.
This is just bad scholarship. I don't know what to say to this. I don't know. I don't have any other words. This is just bad scholarship. That this is like the data does not suit my. This is almost that I want to arrive at a conclusion. So I don't know how to say it. That's what it seems to me.
I'll give you another example. Mr. Narendra Modi is an OBC by caste.
Yeah.
He is a Ghachi, right? Ghachis were classified as OBCs sometime in the 1990s in the Gujarat list. Yeah. Later on, it was changed, right? So I'll give you another example on this question of, there's an academic debate about intermediate castes and so on. A lot of and that is a debate to be had, that when is a caste a dominant enough caste and should not be classed. That's a different debate. But when something is in the law, you can't ignore it. I'll give you an example. Devi Gowda is a Vokaliga. Devi Gowda is the first OBC Prime Minister of India. Narendra Modi is the second OBC Prime Minister of India. But Devi Gowda is a Vokaliga. Vokaligas are listed as OBCs in the Karnataka list. Now, if you will somebody come and tell me कि no, ये dominant caste है because they have been dominant in their politics for a long time. इनको OBC हम count नहीं करेंगे. Why? Because I don't feel like doing it. I mean, come on, man.
This is exactly what I was going to tell you. So this whole idea of a dominant caste is very interesting. So where this comes from is, I'm sorry to say, these are not your words, these are mine, but this is my understanding, is it is literally as if any caste in India that votes for BJP or happens to consider BJP as a viable option suddenly becomes क्या बोलते, kosher नहीं है भैया ये अभी. So my modeling has to be based on the caste that is not trying to vote for BJP. And then, I mean, and this whole concept of dominant caste, like, it doesn't matter, right? What should matter is what the states consider to be OBC, SC, ST, and what are general category. That's the only way you matter. But let's go forward. And I want to ask you another question about this, is that,
okay, may I say something before the question, Kushal,
sure,
with your permission? See,
sure.
I think this is not a light matter. There is a deep academic debate about dominant caste, intermediate caste. It's been going on since the time of M.N. Srinivas from the 1950s. All caste scholars, great scholars of the past, people like Dipankar Gupta, M.N. Srinivas to begin with, now Dipankar, many others, have engaged with this question. In this country, for the last 8, 9, 10 years, there have been many caste movements for changing the classification of castes. For you have Kapus, for example, agitating. You've got Marathas agitating in Maharashtra for changing the classification. You've got Jat agitations in parts of Rajasthan and others. That is all part of one debate, right? You can have that in Jats, for example, which we talked about. Jats were added by the UPA government even onto the national OBC list before it lost power in 2014. That decision was struck down by the Supreme Court. And it was challenged again, but that debate is happening. They are not on the national list because the Supreme Court struck it down. But on the state list, they are. When you are talking, the point is, you can, when you're making normative arguments, you can have different views and normative arguments. This should be the case or not be the case. Is this dominant enough? Is it not? Those are academic arguments which must be had. But when you talk about data and make definitive statements on political parties based on specific numerical data, you've got to get your categories wrong by the law of the land. If you don't, it's terrible scholarship.
Yeah, and the problem here is that the conclusion is already decided that BJP is a Brahmin Baniya party. Now I need to fit the data to get to that conclusion. I'm sorry, that's not good scholarship then. It doesn't matter where the data takes you. I mean, to use Julia Galef's argument about the scout mindset. The scout mindset should only tell you, is this true or not? It doesn't matter. If it's true, it's true. If BJP is a Brahmin Baniya party, it is a Brahmin Baniya party. If BJP is fundamentally changing as a party, it is changing. I mean, we can't do much about it, right? But now let's get into some other bits in the book also. See, the book is very big. We can't cover every aspect of it. And I want to take a few questions. So, maybe before we start taking the questions, I want to focus on the other two aspects of this, which is what you take up. Now, there's a beautiful cross-analysis between, you show in the book through data analysis of what BJP talks about, which is parallel to what RSS talks about. And how the RSS talks about very different things and the BJP sometimes talks about completely different things. And this whole bogey of BJP ke upar RSS ka influencer, BJP ke upar RSS ka influencer. But when you look at the analysis of what RSS stands for and what BJP stands for, in fact, one more book that I spoke about was, a wonderful book. It was his PhD thesis paper by Dr. Ratan Sharda, where he basically went into all the archives of all the RSS literature, where he analyzed what RSS had to say about different incidents that have happened in the country. And people always say RSS doesn't speak up, RSS doesn't speak up, and then he was like, look, they have a proper organization that does these things, and he copiously referenced them. So let's talk about that. So what did you find when you analyzed the RSS data and the BJP data?
Right. So I think before I answer that question specifically, I want to preface it with a couple of qualifiers. The first qualifier is that the RSS and the BJP ideologically, they're very different organizations. But ideologically, there's an understanding on key aspects which they share. Now, there are different, multiple RSS-linked bodies, all of which have their own, their own priorities or areas they work on. Broadly, on Hindu nationalism, I think there is a understanding. I think the difference is on the specific aims of each organization and what they're hoping to get out of each of this. Like the BJP is a very political organization. Now, that's one. Second is, so when we point out the differentiation between their communication, that doesn't mean that there is a dispute between these organizations about that. It is simply about what they privilege as the most important thing and what they communicate to their audiences. And that tells us something very interesting about the Parivar. The first big difference is that, and this surprised me, that most of us think that, or at least most liberals think of the BJP as a one-trick pony, focused only on Hindutva. If you see the news channel daily slugfight you see every night, you see newspaper headlines, that's the impression you will get. It's only on the question of Hindus and Muslims and so on and so forth. Now, that's a very important fault line at which BJP is the center of it. It's a lightning rod at the center of it. But what this data tells us in the other index is that is just one of the axes on which it fights. And there are many other axes which it privileges, which is significantly important in getting it the floating class of voters that it has, without which it would never have had the advances it had. So what are the differences? First thing is that the BJP, we track the 25 or 30 top things the BJP talks about, both online and offline. And we found that the core issues of the BJP, which what is it? It is issues around Hinduism, issues around Hindutva, the Ram temple, Article 370. These are the core issues of the BJP, right? These are not even in the top 10 of the issues that the BJP talks about. If you see it over a period of time, they are at the importance of these increases over time at different points of time. But if you track it on a bar chart, you will see that these are lower down its order of priority. Doesn't mean these issues are not important. They are very important to it. But in terms of volume, it talks about many other issues far more, which get lost in the headlines. But that is the outreach it is doing to these constituencies. What are those issues? Issues around farmers, development, around women. Women is in the top 5 for Narendra Modi. So that, and see, there's been a huge debate around farm laws in this country, right? That is also one of the key axes of the UP election that's happening right now. Till this data, it was tracked till 2019. Till 2019, one of the reasons why a lot of the farming vote was with the BJP was because it was talking to farmers in a language and in a volume which was far more than other parties, which is not captured in the headline. That's what the Narad Index told us. Whereas the RSS privileges these issues much more. And it privileges education around these issues much, much higher. So there is a distinction. Even when you compare BJP, Narendra Modi and RSS, there is a distinction. And that distinction is this. The BJP talks about the Congress since 2016. The BJP talks most about the Congress. That's interesting because it's the party in power. Normally, it is a party not in power that talks most about the party in power, right? Even in 2014, when the BJP fundamentally came with the promise of Achhe Din on the back of an anti-establishment sweep, fervor in the country against the UPA 2, and with the idea of Narendra Modi as a new leader, even at that election, it was not talking so much about the Congress. But since 2016, in the BJP's external publicity, Congress is number 1, then Narendra Modi, then the party itself, then the key issues like development, farmers, and so on, and below that, the core issues. The interesting part is, when the BJP, when you look at Kamal Sandesh, its own communication to its own party workers, Congress is not number 1. What that tells me is that one of the key messages the BJP is telling its external audiences is that we are the anti-Congress party. One of the key things about us is Narendra Modi as a leader, of course, our positioning, our ideology, of course, everything else. But what we are is that we are not the Congress. Whereas when it's telling its own party workers, people who are already converted to the cause, in the Kamal Sandesh, Congress is not number 1. Because there it doesn't need to tell them that, we are the anti-Congress party. They're already converted to the cause, right? And that is about communication, segmentation of messaging. The RSS does not talk about the Congress at all.
Now, this is the interesting bit. And also what I find very interesting is how the others look at the BJP also, which is something you do talk about it, and how it tends to have that relationship with BJP and how it plays out in the electoral field. Obviously, you don't go ahead and give any kind of larger declarations, which is something that I enjoyed in the book. That you don't go ahead and क्योंकि आपने ऐसा किया ऐसा हुआ. You just say this is what they're doing. This is what they're doing. Just to connect it to something very interesting, somebody did the speech analysis of Arvind Kejriwal recently, which I came across, and Arvind Kejriwal just doesn't talk about Narendra Modi at all, which is also a very interesting facet that, which is a change from what their politics is. Apparently, I guess the word on the street is that if you keep talking about Narendra Modi, it seems to have a disproportionately beneficial effect to Narendra Modi. So the game seems to be, according to some people, is that you don't talk about it. Fair enough. Now I want to focus about two factors. You did mention it in a passing way, but let us dig a little deeper here. One is how you show a targeted and systematic approach in the BJP messaging and the larger policy framework in how BJP designs its policies to garner the women vote bank. And also, I request you to talk about a little bit about, because I think it's only fair, and you have given such a huge portion of your book to the BJP Muslim relationship. If we could talk about that, and then maybe we can take the live viewer questions.
Absolutely. So first on the policy question, Kushal, if I understood it right, see, one of the, there are three primary drivers, I think, of the BJP's growth at a national level, especially in the Hindi heartland. One is caste, and building a new social coalition of bringing a whole bunch of castes that were never part of its umbrella inside its tent. Now, whether that is sustainable, whether it's irreversible, whether this is a permanent shift, is a different question. We are talking about this happened in 2014 to 2019, right? Now, the second was of what is called Labhartis, the Hindi for beneficiaries of government schemes. And these are specific to direct benefit transfer schemes where people get money in their pocket through the mobile phone and Aadhaar. And this is something which was set up under the UPA 2 under Manmohan Singh. It was tested out. And the interesting thing is with this, and the third is the question of Hindu mobilization as well. So let me take the policy part first. See, the policy part was set up by Manmohan Singh, the direct benefit transfers. If you remember, there was a huge debate about Aadhaar. The UPA government was split apart on that. Finally, the Supreme Court enabled it. A UIDA was set up. 1st January 2013, direct benefit transfers were launched as a pilot project in 51 districts in India. Jairam Ramesh was the Rural Affairs Minister. What happened was, when they tested it out, there were lots of problems in the implementation. By the time they got it more or less right, the election happened and the Congress lost power. Narendra Modi comes to power as the Prime Minister. The genius of Narendra Modi on this question was that, in fact, I had a long conversation with Nandan Nilekani on this, which is in the public record at the Times Lit Fest, where Nandan Nilekani and Narendra Modi had a meeting. They had built India Stack, which enabled much of the backend for bank transfers and much of the digital backend for the digital economy. He explained they had a conversation on the importance of this. Narendra Modi saw it and he doubled down on it and he backed it politically and put it at the center of his welfare schemes. Now, what does that mean? Here's an example. In 2013-14, which includes the period when Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister, there were only 28 schemes that were part of the direct benefit transfer mechanism. By 2018-19, that went up to 434 schemes. That's a 15-fold increase. That's what I mean by doubling down. Further, in 2013-14, the money that was dispersed to these beneficiaries, and remember, these are not monies going into some government scheme which you don't know what will happen in that. This is money going into people's pockets through as benefits, right? So somebody gets it in their account. It was 7,367 crores in 2013-14. By 2018-19, that number went up to 2.14 lakh crore, which is a 29-time increase. And in terms of beneficiaries, the number of people who benefited from this, in 2013-14, that number was 10.8 crore. That went up to 76.3 crore, which was 7 times. If you add the benefits which were given in kind along with the cash, that number went up by 44 times. So that is the nature of change. Now, why is this important? This is very important. This is not just all governments spend money on development and welfare. The BJP did two things differently. First, this was enabled by a by circumstances. See, this was enabled because of the mobile phone revolution and the cheap mobile phone and cheap data that started in 2015 with the launch of Jio. Then the DBT architecture was built prior to BJP coming to power, which doubled down and really put its whole political backing behind it. And then many of these programs went into project mode. I'll give you an example. PM Awas Yojana is a scheme. Often the opposition critique is, what did BJP do? It only took old schemes, renamed them, and did the same and did publicity around it. That is not true in the two schemes I looked at. PM Awas Yojana, there was an older scheme called Indira Awas Yojana, which was launched in 1989, that was going on for years. It was not a time-bound scheme, right? And what was happening was that government would build houses and the poor would be given these houses. But very often the take-up would not be very much for a simple reason. One, there was leakage in the system, huge, which we all know in government schemes. Second was, you imagine you've got a maid who's living in a certain area. They're living in a slum. The government says, I built a house for you 20 kilometers away. You have to move there. Your husband is an auto driver. Your kids go to school here. You will never move there, right? So what happened with DBT schemes was, in PM Awas Yojana, the government said, we will not build houses. We will give you the money. We'll give you 1.2 lakh rupees if you're below the poverty line and don't have a pakka house. You will build the house yourself where you are. And the money will be given in tranches. The first tranche comes. When the first tranche is done, somebody will verify it. It's put on a GPS. It's geotagged. It's a live dashboard. I've seen that dashboard. And then you get the second tranche. The same thing happened with Swachh Bharat toilets. There's been a lot of debate about open defecation free. India declared itself 100% open defecation free. There's been a lot of academic debate that we are not 100% defecation free. Sure, you'll always find a village where there's open defecation happening or a slum where it's happening. But the real revolution in Swachh Bharat was the personal toilets that were built. For women, 12,500 rupees you get to build a toilet. You know how many toilets were built? 169 million toilets were built in a 5-year period. That changed the lives of women. In the houses, 17 million houses were built. And fundamentally, you raise the question of women in this country. This is a country where women did not have inheritance rights to parental property till 2005. If I have a sister, my sister would not have a claim to my father's house unless my father willed it to her. Right? Only I would have a claim. This is that kind of country. Only in 2005, the Supreme Court enabled that, but only for people whose parents died from that day onwards. Only in September 2020 or August 2020, the Supreme Court said this right is for women whose parents died even before in perpetuity. In such a country, you built 17 million houses for the poor who they built themselves by 1.2 lakh rupees in their accounts, and the government stipulated that these houses will be registered in the names of women as the first option. So 65% houses were registered either in the names of women, of these 17 million, alone, or jointly in the names of the woman and their husband. This is a revolution. Many of these women will at least vote for BJP once.
I couldn't agree more, because I'll share my experience. I worked on a couple of villages under the Sansad Adarsh Gram Yojana, one of the schemes that were launched by the Narendra Modi government in their first scheme. And I clearly remember. So what happens under SAGY is that you go and do a thorough survey of the village. It is basically, so let's say village is divided into padas, right? So one of the villages I was working on had 9 padas. So how the government worked was, every pada will have their own members as part of the survey team. So you get, literally people who are living there, part of the survey team, and they form teams and they go and look at the village. So in many houses that I would go, they would be like, this house is not included in the scheme of the bathrooms, because you spoke about Swachh Bharat. So I was like, why? Unfortunately, I'm not able to pull out the photos out of my archives, but I would have shown you. So I was like, bathroom kahan hai? So they're like, ye bathroom hai. And I'm not making it up. Under the old scheme, the bathroom was 4 bamboo, uske around tarpatri bandi hui hai, tarpaulin. They just took a tarpaulin, they dug a hole in the ground, and that was the old scheme bathroom. And I was like, nahi, ye ghar mein hoga. Bolte, nahi sahab, har ghar mein yahi hai. It was. In the new scheme, I clearly remember, because 12,000 rupees diye ja rahe the. So the point was, garib aadmi banayega kaise? That's a legit point. Unke paas paise kahan hote hain? So how did we work around that? So 6,000 was transferred directly into the bank account of the villager. Immediately, जैसे ही पैसा आया, जाके material खरीदो. Material लिया जाता था, and the bathroom was built. Once the bathroom is built, the next lot of 6,000 is given. A photo is taken. The bathroom is geotagged. You can literally look it up in the SAGI website of that village. So yeah, totally relate with you because I've done it myself.
See, the other thing I want to say is that, look, there are many academic studies which are about leakages in these schemes. Sure, no scheme is perfect. There will always be issues in leakages and so on. All I'm saying is the numbers I've used are numbers from the dashboard and what are reported in Parliament by various ministries. In Parliament, when they report, they check it, more than what is work in progress data. The point I'm trying to make is even if 10, 15, 20% of these numbers are not correct, even then these numbers are huge enough to be revolutionary. And that's something we must take account of.
So finally, I found the photo, just so that people don't think I'm making this up. Yes, Nalin, this was it. This was the bathroom in the old scheme. Now I'm going to show you the bathroom in the new scheme. So just wait. I'm going to take this photo off because as you were saying this, I could immediately go back to, "Arey yaar, yehi hua tha, haan, yehi hua tha, yehi mera." Like every time I was reading your book, I could constantly go back to my old experience. And then this was the new bathroom under the new scheme. Obviously, the villager in this case, he spent extra money and he built 2 bathrooms. But otherwise, normally wo ek banta tha. So he was like, no, I'm getting support from the government. I'm going to make a proper washroom for myself and I'll use it. And believe me, not only do they do this, I know it for the fact in the villages I've worked in, there are follow-ups and how many of them are using it as a washroom or isko almari ka ghar bana ke rakh diya hai. That also is followed up by the Gram Sevak.
The main difference in these schemes has been that what I was saying, project mode, there was a time-bound target put. There was Swachh Bharat, there was a target put. By this time, so many toilets have to be built. On PM Awas, there's a 2025 target. So this much year, so district collectors are under pressure to put the money out. In fact, I spoke to many district collectors on this in Bharatpur, for example. And he said, look, the first tranche was easy because the money comes, I have to push the tranche out. I have the people who are mapped under the criteria who are eligible. The issue is, uske baad to get the work done because second tranche I have to verify. Now there are not enough bricklayers, there are not enough masons in this district to do that. So then you have to get those trained. So there is a whole knock-on effect to this which happens below the surface. On the question of women, Kushal, I mean, thanks for showing the thing. See, one of the major reasons which has driven the growth of the BJP is the creation of a new women vote. This is important for 2 or 3 reasons. Apart from the fact because apart from the fact that women voting is so important, it is this, that for a very long time, from the 1960s, the Election Commission started reporting the gender breakup of voters in India. From the 1960s till for the next few decades, there was always a huge gender gap in voting. Men always voted much more than women. And there was always this sense that when the women who voted, significant parts voted, not all, but significant parts of them voted what community leaders or their husbands or their patriarchs were telling them. In fact, often the voting gap was as much as 12-13%. 2019 was the first election in which the women turnout rate was slightly higher than the male turnout rate. 1. Second, historically at the national level among national parties, women have always voted more for Congress than BJP. The gap has been this much. That gap started narrowing in the last 10 years, but in 2019, the data shows us, at least one of the surveys that was done state by state showed among national parties, the first, women voted a bit more than men. Second, they voted significantly more in favor of BJP than compared to Congress in several states. So that's a very major thing. The question I wanted to ask was, our women chapter looks at this, that why did this happen? Did it happen by accident? Did it happen purely because of something else which is happening, or there was specific outreach towards women that led to this shift at a time when there is a revolutionary change happening about women's awareness and gender issues in this society? And what we found was that the BJP used 4 or 5 specific strategies that aimed at precisely this result. One of those was the welfare schemes. And these are schemes, by the way, which are not women-specific schemes. They are schemes by the Women's Ministry, which are separate. I'm talking about schemes like Stand Up India, schemes like the Atal Pension Yojana. You look at so many schemes, you will find that a vast majority of beneficiaries in that are women. So that is something which is been very specific, because these schemes report the number of beneficiaries by caste and by gender, and that is very clear. That's one. Second is, and that goes back to the Narad Index, that Prime Minister Narendra Modi specifically did major outreach personally to women voters. This is an older strategy which he used also in Gujarat. In fact, his triumphs in Gujarat in 2002, 7, and 15, and 12 in particular, were driven to a large extent by women voters, and he often used to do Mahila Sabhas specifically with them. That's a strategy he brought. In fact, he held many Mahila Sabhas in Karnataka and many states specifically to women voters. The third was, and we are talking now just a bit after Republic Day. If you saw on Republic Day, you saw so many women soldiers on display. The woman pilot of the Rafale, so many contingents being led by women officers. Look, this is not an accident. The BJP did not invent women coming as officers into the armed forces. That's an older thing. But what the BJP has done as part of concerted policy is to showcase it far more. Right now, at the same time, if you look at the numbers of bharti of women in police in UP, for example, nationally, of women positions in the police and in the armed forces, the Supreme Court has ruled recently about, and that was a Supreme Court judgment about getting women into the National Defense Academy. Look at the numbers who applied. That is one thing. That is policy. Second is showcasing it and privileging it and putting out the message. If you every time. I wish I had the pictures just now, like you showed the pictures. I wish I had the foresight to have some of these. If very often Narendra Modi goes to forward posts and gets himself photographed on Diwali, on other places, right? Go back to those pictures, you will see there will always be 2 women officers or 1 or 2 or 3 standing next to him. This is very much part of the positioning of privileging women, and along with that, the BJP also focused on bringing women into positions of power and influence publicly at every level. Nirmala Sitharaman is the first finance minister of India who's a woman. Indira Gandhi was earlier, but she held it at dual charge as prime minister. But she's the first one who's not a prime minister who's holding it. But below that level, in UP, for example, at the booth level, they made a thing that the parties from the booth level onwards, there are 21 member Karyakarinis or working groups that run the party. The booth level, then there's a level below. Above that, there's a level at the district, then state. They said out of 21, 5 have to be women, 10 have to be scheduled caste or OBC. This started in after 2014. When you bring in so many people into the party, there'll be many of them who've never voted for BJP before. So it was all part of a strategy. So far, it has worked for the BJP. Now, there is a dichotomy here, because in the urban areas, on CA, on NRC, many of the protests against the BJP have been led by women activists. That's a fact. That's also a fact. And therefore, a lot of liberal academics and journalists don't see the fact that women, but outside of those circles, in rural India, there is the making of a massive women vote, which the BJP has constructed and which is at the center of its growth in the last 5 years.
True. So Nalin, now let's take, because there are a lot of questions. I mean, I could have continued with my questions, but let's get into the viewers' questions. So someone has said, managing different castes and classes and RSS can be, sometimes be a tricky job, and because you have ambitions and egos of politicians. So in your study of the BJP's history or over the years, how do you think, what has BJP done so perfectly that they manage these things that no major splits or infightings happen? What was your analysis?
Sorry, the question is specific to with the RSS or within the party?
No, within the BJP. So what happens is, so there is the caste, right? You have to look at the caste breakup, then you have to look at the class breakup, and then you also have the RSS influence as a separate outside factor. So how do you think BJP has still managed to remain a cohesive unit over the years, in spite, look, there is infighting in every political outfit, but how has BJP still managed to keep on growing in spite of that? In your
I think the answer to that question is that, look, people who are into politics are into politics. Human nature is such that when you enter politics, there are different people have different motivations, right? Some people want power, some people want it for social good, but there's a certain kind of person who enters politics on a full-time basis. In fact, at the end of the book, we point out the 5 challenges to the BJP and 2 or 3 advantages that it has. One of those challenges is managing the inherent contradictions of the BJP today, at least in UP or in the heartland, is like the Congress of earlier, which was a social umbrella of many different diverse competing interests, which is different from the BJP before 2014, which is only of certain castes. What happens is when you get so many people into the tent, somebody will lose more than what they were losing earlier. So there will always be that dissension. You are seeing some of that in this UP election. In this UP election, you've seen the defection of some of the BJP's OBC ministers. How much impact that will have, that we will see. You have seen issues with Jats, Jats, for example, were one of the castes that OBC castes that supported BJP in 14, 17 and 19. 90% data showed us that in 2019, 90% of Jats voted for the BJP. This time, I think the evidence so far is that the Jat vote is split. So yeah, so those contradictions are always going to be there. The challenge now that you've built this behemoth, which is different from before, the real challenge now is managing these contradictions. I'll give you an example of the RSS. I was speaking to an Prant Pracharak, head of a Prant of the RSS. He told me, he said, our membership is increasing so much. My biggest challenge as the head of this Prant for the RSS is that I don't know how many of them are coming in to be closer to power and how many are coming in because they believe in our ideology. And that is my challenge. How many people will leave if the BJP loses power? So therefore, he said, that's my test as a leader to know who's genuine and who's a fair weather bird. So I think that's the nature of politics. And how the party deals with it depends on the quality of the leadership and so on and so forth. So, so that's an evolving question.
Fair enough. This is a very interesting question. So this is about data set and modeling. So someone has asked, what data set modeling could BJP have used, let's say, to avoid defeat in 2004 instead of, whatever they used? Like, what has changed in their internal modeling in your studies, that how have they transformed into such a micro focus party in comparison to, say, 2004? Why this change? What has happened suddenly?
So I think there are, okay, so this is a very good question. I think, we often think that data modeling or data is a magic bullet. It is not. Data, if you get it, firstly, you can get data modeling wrong, you can get your data wrong, but if you get it right, let's say in an ideal world, data can only tell you directions. The real difference is what calls you take as a leader, what calls you, strategies you take, and every decision you take, you will piss off somebody else. Do you have the leeway to take that right call and fight it out and put your neck on the line? And that is a difference. In 2000, the BJP of 2004, of 2009, of 2000, vis-a-vis the BJP of 14 and 19 are very different organisms. I'll give you an example. One of the underestimated aspects of the BJP's triumph in 2019 was, the BJP had a full majority of MPs in 2014. There was anti-incumbency. There was no question, there was no anti-incumbency in several constituencies. The BJP dropped 113 of its sitting MPs in 2019. What was the result? 90% of these seats where it dropped sitting MPs, it won. Had it not dropped them, the result could have been different. And that is the call that was taken by the party. Now, obviously, the counterfactual to that is, not the counterfactual, but the risk in that was, when you drop a sitting MP, his supporters will not vote for you. He will create dissension, he or she. They took that call. And the result was 90%. How many other parties will do that? Because, and that is ruthlessness. This is a model that, so what I'm saying is that the data showed them by various, checks and balances. There was an Amit Shah's team that was working on doing surveys. BJP had its own surveys. See, today's day and age, data is not rocket science. Every party has access to the same data. You only have to pay the right people to give you the right data sets. After that, it is what you make of it and what calls you take on it. This is an example of that.
So basically, if somebody was to ask, so the architect of the change then would certainly be this new team led by Modi and Amit Shah that are basically ruthless when it comes to the only criteria that matters by and large. I'm not saying 100%, but yes, by and large, most of the times it matters is winnability matters, nothing else matters.
And I want to respond to this point. This is a very good point. See, there is no question that the post-2014 BJP, the new BJP as I call it, was set up by Narendra Modi, building on previous things and with Amit Shah and so on and so forth. This is a different organism organizationally than the previous BJP on many levels. It is a rural party, which it wasn't earlier. It is a party of multiple castes, which it wasn't earlier. It is built on Labharatis, which it wasn't earlier. But more than that, there is a serious political mobilization around Labhar. Every party has Labharatis. Every government has. They built with the list massive mobilization to convert these into voters. And along with that, there's something which struck me when I was researching this. The BJP was always dependent on RSS cadres, inordinately so, before 2014, because its own cadre had the same problems that every other party has. Interesting part is, how is the BJP the biggest party in the world today? Because they launched massive membership drives. The interesting part is they did not launch these membership drives before the election. They launched it after winning 2014 election, few months after that. And the second one was a few months after winning 2019. And that is what led to its great cadre growth. Now, sure, some of these cadres can also leave. Some of these will be disaffected. Some of them can defect when they lose power. But the fact of the matter is, today's BJP is far less dependent on the RSS than the previous BJP was. It's ideologically linked, but its dependence for last mile connectivity for getting the vote out is significantly reduced with the RSS than it was before. And the power equation has changed.
Yep, I agree with you. Now, this someone has asked, what are the problems faced on the ground level by your team and you yourself when you were collecting data, and what was the resistance?
That's a great question. So the issues we had were around the Mehta Singh index in particular. So, for example, on the Narad index, let me talk about Narad index. One of the Narad index, when Rishabh was modeling it, we looked at both English and Hindi. I wish I could have gone into regional languages too. We could have had a more differentiated set on different states. But we were testing it out, and we stuck to English and Hindi. And then we were getting the spellings right for the keywords and search word. That was one small technical challenge. It was important, but it was there. But the real challenge was in the Mehta Singh index, because the biggest challenge was that when you are going and checking the castes of a whole, you got an Excel sheet with thousands of names on it, and you're checking the caste of each person. So when you go and find out, who do you believe that this person is right? So one was getting the quality of that thing out and triangulating different pieces of information on that one caste name, and then taking a call. Okay, now that we've checked it with 5 different people, this is the antecedent of this person. So typically we check with the district level party presidents of those parties. We checked with family members of those people. We checked with key notables in those districts and with other politicians. And only when we had triangulated all of this, we signed off, okay, now this name is verified, and these are the antecedents of the authority of the people who have named this caste from this place. So, you had to go to every constituency to check the right people who would give us the right information. But we didn't believe only 3 or 4 or 5 people. We did multiple checks. The more difficult problem was, and this I did not expect. It was not that difficult to find the castes of people for this election or the previous one or the 2-3 elections before that. But when you start looking at elections before that, for 15 years ago, 1990, 1994, then people say, "Humko yaad hi nahi hai." So that became a bit more challenging. So in fact, Jay's team and the Voters Mood Research, when they independently checked this without seeing our findings, they said, we can do last 3 elections. Before that, problem ho raha hai. So they also came across the same problem. And one last anecdote: the biggest problem we had was with BSP candidates, especially going back more than 2 or 3 elections. The reason for that was that for other parties, candidates normally had some kind of organic link with the party. So typically you would always find somebody in the party who would personally know that person, who would tell us the caste of that person. With BSP, there were many candidates in the past who were given tickets who were not linked to the party in any way before or after. And therefore, many people in the BSP, often the BSP district president in a district will tell us, "I've never heard of this person before." But I would say, yeah, but this guy was a candidate in 1998 or 2000, early 2000. How can you not know this person? You will know, somebody will know this person. And so in BSP, we found it more than in other parties, that particular problem.
Interesting. So again, very good question here. Somebody says that if BJP is so good at micro targeting and micro assessments, what do you think are the reasons for their failure to not penetrate beyond Karnataka and southern India?
Very good question. In fact, we have a chapter on Karnataka in the book. I think the answer to that is that, see, I don't think fundamentally that just cadre building or messaging builds a political party. I think those are things that gives you arms and legs. Those are things that give you strength on the ground. In close elections, they make a big difference. But fundamentally, people vote for parties because they touch a chord with them for one reason or the other. Karnataka, the BJP's growth has been very specific. It has been built on, firstly, it's been around for 30 years. From the 30s onward, there were 2, 3 reasons why Karnataka became a BJP bastion, the first BJP bastion south of the Vindhyas. One of them was the whole the whole issue with Lingayats, that the Lingayats moved, which are the major community in Karnataka. They moved to the BJP after being, after the whole the Patil episode, when Patil was sacked by Rajiv Gandhi in the late 80s as chief minister. Lingayats moved one side. Second issue was that there was a whole Janata Dal politics in Karnataka. A lot of the Janata Dal leaders, JD and BJP were partners. Fundamentally, a lot of the Janata Dal leaders moved to Karnataka. Karnataka is also not a state which has had a huge history of sub-nationalism or language movements and so on. It's a multilingual state. Karnataka is a very different state from Kerala, from the history of Kerala or Tamil Nadu. So there are specific historical reasons why BJP grew in Karnataka, and they are explained in the book. To answer your question about Tamil Nadu or Kerala, I think the next state where you're going to see advances of the BJP in the south of the Vindhyas is Telangana. The reason for that is that there is a political vacuum in Telangana. After the creation of Telangana, the Congress has disappeared. There is an anti-establishment vote. Every government will have an anti-establishment vote. Even the BJP, at the height of its success in 2014, more than 60% of voters in this country did not vote BJP, even in 2019. In Telangana also, this government has been in power for its second term now since the formation. There is an anti-establishment vote. The Congress has disappeared. The BJP is now the anti-establishment party in Telangana. And if you see the results of 2019, the seats that BJP won, they were in the strongholds of the TRS, including of the family of KCR. So I think Telangana is the next state to watch out for. Tamil Nadu and Kerala are different. There are pockets of influence Kerala, there has often been a history of antagonism. RSS has been strong in parts of Kerala. In Kerala, there are pockets where the BJP is strong in terms of vote share, but not in seats. So it's a long way off. Tamil Nadu, we all know about the back end that happens between ADMK and BJP and so on and so forth. There are pockets where several castes in Tamil Nadu have been moving toward BJP at a smaller level. It's not significant enough right now to see a result in electoral results, but it could happen slowly at a certain point of time. In Kerala, there are several communities, including Christian communities, which have come out in support of BJP. It's not enough right now for them to become significantly change the electoral outcome. But you are seeing signs of this. How long it takes, when, we don't know. But Telangana is the next big one. And Karnataka, Congress and BJP, they have a different history in that state.
So I guess 2-3 people have asked this question. What do you see as the future problems that could stem for the BJP, considering the kind of growth it is going? So somebody has asked, BJP now tends to, I think it is because BJP just looks at winnability as the sole criteria. So a lot of defectors from other parties have also now started coming in and absorbing itself into the BJP. So what could be the possible downsides of that? And also somebody has asked the general question that could BJP also, now that it's the largest political party in the world, do you see BJP becoming complacent and getting into a more authoritarian kind of a streak in that sense?
I think these are great questions. At the end of the book, I do list out 5 major challenges for the BJP. And I think the first challenge, some of the challenges are exactly the ones that you pointed out. The first major challenge, I think, is the question of the fallout of the coronavirus and the economy. We are seeing some of that in these elections which are happening now, in Uttarakhand in particular, in UP to a lesser extent. The second wave, the fallout of that, some of it has been mitigated significantly with the vaccination rollout and so on and so forth. But the memories of the dead bodies in the Ganga, every government would have struggled with what happened with the oxygen shortages. Everybody in this country got affected. So there is definitely an issue, but it also affects the economy in much larger ways. We have only now recovered Now, and you can have many debates about whether we could have done better or worse. That's different. But the fact of the matter is, today the economy has just about come the size of the GDP to what it was before the coronavirus started, right? There was a 21% growth rate in the last Q. That was because the economy had collapsed completely during the productive activity had happened completely during the beginning of the first lockdown. Now it's around 8%. The fact of the matter is, when you raise expectations, you're going to have a welfare scheme. India is getting more prosperous, and other indicators. At some point, that is not enough. People want more kinds of jobs. So the fallout of the economy and jobs, that is a very major challenge. You need to have higher growth rates. The other point is that the BJP's model this is not just about growth rates and economic neoliberal versus leftist arguments. The fact of the matter is, outside of jobs and what people feel about the economy themselves, see, so far the economy has not hurt the BJP politically. One reason for that is that the RBI, for example, does consumer confidence surveys across multiple cities every quarter, and they've done it for the last 20 years. So that's a good way to track. This is done by the RBI, so it's completely apolitical. One of the things that surveys showed us is that it is not, a lot of liberals think, look, people are stupid and these people are getting hurt by the economy, but they're still voting for BJP for other reasons. No, the people know exactly that what is wrong with the economy or what is happening to them. The RBI survey shows this, that when you ask people what happened to your job and your economic prospects, they ask them two questions. How do you rate the economy in the last 1 year? How do you rate your own job prospects in the last 1 year? Consistently since the demonetization, on those two questions, the answer has been negative in the RBI surveys, right? And very negative, in the minus. But when you ask them, what is your prospect? How do you rate the economy's prospects in the next 1 year and your own job prospects in the next 1 year? Their answer is very high, very positive. Now, typically Indians are, Pew Research surveys shows us, typically Indians are more hopeful than statistically than Western Europeans and other developed countries. Even so, the fact of the matter is that people at a larger level, at a macro level, these surveys show us, have given the BJP benefit of doubt. People still think that things will change. They'll get better jobs. That can change. When that changes, the BJP will pay a political price for it. So, and I think that is a big challenge. The second is that the BJP's model of the economy in many ways out is political mobilization, because welfareism and Labharti are so important. If the economy doesn't do too well, and we have huge fiscal deficits, which the government is working on, they run out of money for those welfare schemes themselves. So that's another challenge. The second major challenge, and I think the first is the economy and the fallout of the coronavirus, because that's linked. The second is the China crisis. For a party which is based so much on muscular nationalism, we know what happened with Pulwama, with Balakot airstrikes, how important that was politically, but also as a political statement, as a strategic statement in the larger security environment. You have a crisis with China. No two ways about it. That crisis is continuing. China has made it clear they have made a strategic punt. This is not a localized operation. There's been withdrawals now, agreed withdrawals in certain parts of the LAC. Others are continuing. If that goes out of control, that is a challenge. It's an imponderable. We don't know how that will go, but it is a challenge going forward unless a resolution has happened. It's a different order of challenge in Pakistan. You cannot deal with China the way you deal with Pakistan at all, because they are different military mights and different economies. China can outspend us to death militarily or in any other ways. We can't afford a war as a country, whether you like it or not. Right? You can do a holding operation in the Himalayas. You can't go and attack China in the way you attacked Pakistan. So I think they are different, but it's a challenge. Politically, it will be a challenge. The third, I think, is something we've touched upon, which is what happens when the problems of expansion, when you bring so many people into the tent like defectors, like Madhya Pradesh. The significant number of ministers in Shivraj Singh Chauhan's cabinet are now people who came in with Jyotiradittya Scindia. Now there are people from the older guard who are unhappy. That will happen in every state. So I think how you manage those contradictions by bringing more people into the tent, because you have to give them space. That's why they've come to you. So that, I think, is a challenge, how it manages, and that will depend a lot on the leadership, both nationally and at the state levels. The fourth question, and I think this is an important question, is the leadership in a post-Modi era. But 2024 will be fought under Modi's leadership. But there is no question that while the BJP is has built a structure which is unparalleled in terms of party building compared to. I think the only comparison at a national level is the 1950s Congress in the last 5 years. The Prime Minister continues to bring a serious political premium to the party. There are many people in this country who will not vote for BJP if Modi is not at the helm of BJP. He brings a premium. He's still the most popular leader in this country by a margin. The India Today Mood of the Nation survey shows that popularity fell a little bit in the coronavirus period, but it's recovering. But the margin between him and the next is huge. So in a post-Modi era, the question of leadership is very important. Who will that leader be? Second level is who are the second-rung leaders of the party? The regional satrap. That's another question. The final question, challenge, is the question of secularism and the Hindu-Muslim question. That was raised earlier. We didn't actually address it. But for a party that talks about Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, the question of secularism and doing away with older politically correct talk, which may not have, which may have been counterproductive, and so on. A new conversation of what the role of minorities in this country. That's a very important conversation. The BJP brings a different idea to this than what has been described as the idea of India for a very long time. Whether that is good, bad, that's a different debate. But how that resolves on the ground, I think that is important. It's a challenge for the BJP. If social strife goes outside of ideological certainties of what it believes, the social strife goes beyond a certain level. If there is problems, it will have a knock-on effect on multiple things, including on your economy. So that is a challenge.
Got it. So I think somebody asked this question, why is BJP lacking behind in social media? I will only answer it by this way. There is a dedicated chapter in the entire, there is an entire chapter. If I remember, I think it's a chapter 7. I don't remember the exact name of the chapter. I think it was chapter 7 on BJP's social media strategy. There are some really interesting facts that Nalin has shared over there. So I would recommend the person who has asked this question to go and buy the book, read that chapter, because that person has made some points like, why is BJP lacking behind in social media? Almost zero presence outside Twitter. Any strategy about Insta and YouTube? I think that person will be pleasantly surprised when they look at the data. BJP is the biggest behemoth on social media, and only, as far as if I remember correctly, only on Twitter is where Congress at least gives them a little bit of a run for their money. Otherwise, everywhere else, it is just the biggest dominating behemoth. People also have this misunderstanding about Insta, because what happens is, what is the internet algorithm, right? It will only show you what you watch. A lot of people who are BJP supporters, right, they tend to be cringe viewers on social media. They just go and watch the other side and they get obsessed with it. And then they think that that's all social media is. There is the whole world on Instagram, which is BJP supporters. If you go and watch it, you'll know, like, there are huge BJP handles too. So I'll recommend that person to go and buy the book and read it. But Nalin, before we wrap today's chat up, any last message or words?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Kushal. I think, and for everybody listening and for the lovely questions. The reason why I wrote the book is very simple. It is that, look, at some level, we are all prisoners of our echo chambers. See, we all have a view of the BJP. Whether you support it, whether you think it's good for India, whether you think it's bad for India, whether you oppose it, whether you're mostly nobody is neutral about BJP. Everybody has a view. And I think views don't change over a period of time. The point of this book was to get, and we all get influenced by echo chamber. Like you mentioned, Twitter. The people I follow on Twitter are people who think similar to me mostly. So I will only see what they are saying. And likewise with you. What happens with echo chambers is that we believe something is happening. I think the point of this was to start a new conversation, to get out of this trap of echo chambers, to understand, keeping aside our judgments, our subjective value judgments, because that will be different for every person, to understand the facts of what is happening. Only then can you begin to really understand how India is changing. And for those who oppose the BJP, equally, that's not why I wrote the book, but for those who oppose the BJP, if you want to take on the BJP, you've got to really understand what it's doing before you can begin the real comprehensive response to it. And I think what the BJP has done in the last 5 years, I want to say one thing. When I say, my title says Modi in the making of the world's largest political party. Look, we are the second most populated country in the world. Why should it be surprising? Somebody asked me, what's the big deal? It is a big deal because Okay, China and India will always be the biggest in everything when you look at numbers, but it is a big deal for a simple reason. China is a one-party state. In China, you have no option but to be a member of the Chinese Communist Party. In India is a multi-party democracy. Like I said earlier in this program, at the height of the BJP's successes in 2019, more than 60% of this country, almost 70% of this country, did not vote for BJP. In such a country, if you are still the world's largest political party, that is telling you something is happening in this country. This kind of cadre building was done by the pre-independence Congress. There is no evidence of something of this scale nationally. At the state level, yeah, you've had many parties in DMK, ADMK who build massive cadre bases in Tamil Nadu or other parties in other places. National level, this has not happened. And therefore, I think, for example, the BJP has now built party offices in more than 500 districts, which has bought land and built them. It is invested in building an infrastructure. So it is stronger than it looks. You will lose an election here or there. Then in these elections also, we will see what happens in different states. But as one thing is clear, when the Congress started declining, it took 15 years, 20 years for that impact to be seen in a serious way with the rise of mandal politics and commandal politics in the late 80s. Today, if the BJP stops doing anything, it will still remain the primary or among the top two primary polls of this country for the next few years. So we've got to understand, whether you like BJP or not, you've got to understand what it's doing politically. And I think as citizens, we should be aware of what's happening.
I couldn't agree more. And you know what? I think you summed it up at the latter half of your book, where you say each time the BJP has focused on sharpening its position on Hindutva, the party's ranks have swelled. Every time it has waffled on this issue after the 1990s phase of consolidation under Vajpayee, for instance, it has entered into periods of decline. Yet, Hindutva positioning has never been sufficient on its own to win elections, as this book has documented. Hindutva was the engine that gave it electoral momentum, but election victories were fashioned by creating a unique cocktail of Hinduness, caste re-engineering, and a deep focus on welfareism. And that's the whole point. The caste engineering, welfareism is the main part, and then the salad dressing on top of it is Hindutva. And that's what, as of now, is working for the BJP. We'll wrap today's discussion up. Once again, Nalin, thanks for coming. So to everybody who's watching this right now, or is going to be listening to the audio version, or is going to be watching this video later, in the description of the podcast is the link to buy Nalin's book. I insist each and every one of you, especially if you're a political nerd and you look for data and you want to look and analyze data, believe me, just from this book, in my opinion, you can write at least 200 more essays citing data from this book itself, and you can write 200 more analyses out of it. That is how much data you have in this book. Like, just for an example, I told you on the social media question, there is a dedicated chapter on BJP and its social media strategy. This book is unique. It actually gave me a lot of inputs on how BJP manages. It doesn't mean BJP is invincible. It's not going to lose. Even today, it loses many state elections in spite of its well-oiled machine. And that's the way it is. We'll wrap today's discussion up. So, Nalin, once again, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Kushal. This has been a pleasure, and thank you for listening and letting me talk. And thanks to everybody who joined in and for your questions.
All right, guys, we'll wrap today's discussion up. Please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave your comments over there. Once again, buy the book. It is a must-read book. And if you like what I'm doing over here on the Cārvāka podcast, please become a member on YouTube or Patreon, buy the merchandise, or send your donations to UPI. I will see you next time. Until then, namaste, take care, bye-bye.